In this lecture, we will examine one of the key types of organisations with which local governments share the field, quangos. And by the end of this lecture, you should be able to understand the rationale, role and definition of quangos, appreciate why the bonfire of the quangos is harder to achieve in reality than in rhetoric, and be aware of why and where quangos fit into the theory of governance networks, and give some ways in which both quangos and local government can have their incentives shaped by central government. But overall, we need to realise that quangos are important for how they work with local government, but also in their own right. Before we do this though, we'll just briefly recap the concepts of local government, governance and meta-governance. As we discussed in week 2, one key distinction in the study of local government is the difference between government and governance. So a local government theory sees local policy and service delivery as overwhelmingly the role of the elected local authority, which were overwhelmingly, in the past anyway, dominant actors in their localities. On the other hand, local governance sees local policy and service delivery as a responsibility of numerous actors, e.g. the local council, national government, the NHS, various public bodies or quangos, etc., all of which have a role to play, and with which local authorities have to work. Thus, the local governance model sees local policy framework, or local policy formation rather, and service delivery as emerging from a number of different policy networks, all of which have a different constellation of actors and gives the local authority itself different levels of power in different areas. In many cases, these actors exercise powers which were previously under the exclusive control of local authorities. For example, urban development corporations, housing action trusts, training and enterprise councils, grant-maintained schools, academies, education funding corporations, etc. Another example would be welfare. Once the remit of local authorities, many were originally set up to administer the poor law, for instance, it's now primarily dealt with by the DWP. Now, we won't go into the debate around reforming local government here, but it's worth bearing in mind that any reform to the system of local government to make it more democratic, say, e.g. changes in ward size, local authority size, electoral systems, etc., may have very little impact on the ground if the actual scope of power of a local authority is limited by a shift to local governance. We also have meta-governance, which we covered last week. So proponents of the meta-governance thesis, such as Bailey and Wood, argue that we need to look beyond government versus governance debate and instead look at how these policy networks or governance networks are themselves governed, or how the rules of the game shape the incentives actors have and thus shape how they act. In this sense, meta-governance is the governance of governance. Bailey and Wood argue this is done through the following strategies, and the first is network design, which aims to influence the scope, character, composition and institutional procedures of policy networks, and then also network framing that seeks to determine the political goals, fiscal conditions, legal basis and discursive storylines or narratives of the networks. If you're unsure of any of these three different theories, please revisit them in the reading list because they are very important and they should be important when you answer your essay questions. Quango is an abbreviation of the phrase quasi-autonomous non-governmental organisation and is often used as an alternative to the abbreviation NDPD, which stands for Non-Departmental Public Body. The word quango is not itself a classification that the government has traditionally used. For some, it's a highly emotive term, used as a byword for wasteful bureaucracy, patronage and a lack of democratic accountability. For Wilson and Game, quangos are part of the complex organisational mosaic now widely termed local governance. The term NDPB has been in existence since 1980 when it was coined by Sir Leo Pleitsky in his report on non-departmental bodies. The government publication, Public Bodies, defines NDPBs as follows: a body which has a role in the process of national government but is not a government department or part of one, and which accordingly operates to a greater or lesser extent at arm's length from ministers. However, the use of arm's length public bodies to deliver government policy is not a new phenomenon. As a constitutional monarchy, the UK has long allowed ministers to delegate government functions through the use of royal prerogative. Examples date back as far as the 16th century, when the new functions and responsibilities of the state were commonly given to appointed boards. For example, The Commissioners of Bankruptcy were founded in 1570. The Bank of England was founded in 1570. The British Museum, 1753. And the Met Office in 1854. NDPBs carry out a wide range of functions and, as such, can be further classified into the groups on the slide. So you have executive NDPBs. They are typically established in statute and carry out executive, administrative, regulatory and or commercial functions. Examples include the Environment Agency, the Regional Development Agencies, National Museums and Galleries. Advisory NDPBs provide independent expert advice to ministers on a wide range of issues. Examples include the Low Pay Commission and the Committee on Standards in Public Life. Tribunal NDPBs have jurisdiction in a specialised field of law, such as the Valuations Tribunal, and then you've got independent monitoring boards, such as immigration removal centres, immigration holding rooms, and perhaps like watchdog bodies. However, classification is difficult and often subjective. In their 2010 report, Read Before Burning, the Institute for Government identified at least 11 types of arm's-length bodies. As well as the four above, they added executive agencies, non-ministerial departments, public corporations, independent statutory bodies, special health authorities, parliamentary bodies, and the central bank, the Bank of England. The Public Administration Select Committee and the National Audit Office have complained that the lack of any clear taxonomy of arm's-length bodies hampers our understanding of them, right? And to really it's the case that before any meaningful discussion of reform can be done, we need to know exactly what we're dealing with. And this might be why in your research you see different numbers for, say, the amount of quangos we have, because different organisations are using different metrics to define them. So the classification of a quango is up for debate, and often it's more of a case of you'll know it when you see it than, looking at a central register of quangos. In 1999, the Public Administration Select Committee called for greater clarity and consistency to be brought to the confusing network of bodies which play a crucial role in British government. In 2001, the committee conducted their own mapping exercise. They defined a quango as all bodies responsible for developing or managing or delivering public services or policies, or for performing public functions under governing bodies with a plural membership of wholly or largely appointed or self-appointed persons. However, their definition excluded executive agencies, but did include task forces and local public spending bodies. Headline figures on the number of NDPBs are published by the Cabinet Office in an annual publication, Public Bodies. 2009, for instance, there were 766 NDPBs sponsored by the UK government. Their breakdown is on the slide there. In 2008 to 2009, so this is about a decade ago, isn't it? Total expenditure was around 46.5 billion for executive NDPBs. Of this, around 38.4 billion was funded directly by the government, and the rest was funded through a combination of fees, charges, levies, and other sources of funding, such as national lottery or EU grants, for instance. Advisory and tribunal NDPBs and independent monitoring boards rarely generate their own expenditure, and they're usually resourced and supported by their sponsoring department. There's some controversy over these figures. The Taxpayers Alliance has published a list of public bodies which is much wider than that published by the government, and it includes bodies sponsored by the devolved administrations as well as local and NHS public bodies. According to its own figures, in 2007 and 2008, there were 1,148 semi-autonomous public bodies operating in the UK, and the government spent over 90 billion on or through these bodies that year. For David Walker, it is pointless to either count or classify quangos. There are simply too many, and he argues they are created by an inconsistent neoliberalism, where opportunistic requirements trump consistent rationality. He argues we may just have to conclude that we cannot generalise. It's protein ground. All we have is a bunch of case studies bound into circumstance. This is quite pessimistic, actually. And, quangos exist. They should be studied, and they do have a role in how we are governed. So if it seems as pointless or impossible to classify them, that suggests there's something wrong with quangos as a whole, rather than just throwing our hands up in the air and saying, "Oh, this is how it should all be." We should just ignore it, basically. So local governance brings together governmental and non-governmental agencies in flexible partnerships to deal with different problems using different strategies that, ideally anyway, are relevant, specific, unique, or appropriate for a locale. It's not based on a single authority, the provision of a specialised service, or a new set of structures, but on a fusion of different styles and different working relationships. Under New Labour, there will be no return to local authorities being near-monopolistic service providers. Provision will continue to be shared with a range of partners. There would instead be an emphasis on collaboration between agencies as a way of joining up hitherto fragmented services to meet community needs more effectively. A joined-up government was the central theme of the classic 1999 White Paper, Modernising Government, and quangos were to be a key player in this new paradigm. Of course, New Labour did not invent quangos. The Thatcher major years saw not only a reduction in the number of locally elected authorities, elected local authorities, but also the rapid growth of non-elected or indirectly elected bodies at the expense of directly elected councils. For example, the abolition of the Greater London Council led around 100 new organisations which were responsible for service delivery in Greater London. Joint boards, for example, for things like fire service and waste authorities. These new associations were all structured differently, but they all appointed directly or indirectly by central government, performing functions and providing services that had previously been provided mainly or exclusively by local authorities. They bypass local authorities and may well come into conflict with them. New Labour had somewhat of a U-turn on quango transparency. For years, they ran a quango website and offered a definition, a body with a role in the process of government that operates at arm's length from ministers, before declaring that the New Labour government does not use the term quango. When counted by the House of Commons Public Administration Select Committee, everybody's favourite select committee, in 2000, the number of such bodies in the UK came close to 5,000. The largest category then and now would be the roughly 2,000 registered social landlords, followed by foundation schools, further education institutions and over 200 primary care trusts. They're run by more than 60,000 mainly ministerially appointed or self-appointed quangocrats. And this gives us roughly, at the time at least, 3 quangocrats for every councillor. The coalition government adopted the reverse approach. In opposition, David Cameron carefully refrained from talking of quango bonfires, but within 6 months the government had set light to 192 of them. Some were, in the words of Wilson and Game, completely cindered. Others had their functions taken over by government departments, and some were merged. And so what happened really was, whilst the number of quangos was reduced, the scope of the quangocracy, for an awful term, was not reduced, right? So the number reduced, but you just had bigger quangos with more power. So there's no question that both locally and nationally, quangos can perform important functions and can do so effectively. They can bring valuable experience and expertise into government, national and local, and they can also include sections of society underrepresented through the local electoral system. They may be able to bring objectivity and non-partisan identity to the discussion of sensitive issues. But of course, they're not democratically elected. And so when quangos take over whole areas of policy making and service delivery from elected and, importantly, accountable local authorities, we run the risk of serious democratic deficits emerging. And this isn't just on the narrow electoral level. There's also the issue of standards and transparency. Councils are not only elected and thus removable by the public, but statutory requirements for local authorities' transparency in how they conduct their business are much higher than that for quangos. So councils have to, produce annual reports, have their accounts audited annually, advertise their meetings, publish agendas, and so on. They're subject to extensive direction from the centre, from inspection and regulation, but many quangos, as the House of Commons Public Administration Select Committee found in 2001, are not required to do these, and in many cases choose not to do them. And this once again fits into the technocratic-democratic dichotomy we've spoke about in previous lectures, right? It's very hard to argue that the quangos are democratic, that they are transparent, or that they are in touch with voters. And so there's definitely scope for debate about what their role is in a locally elected democratic system, especially vis-a-vis councillors. Partnership was a new paradigm under New Labour. So essentially many local authorities, well before the government increasingly required it, were working closely and productively in partnership with some of the new quangos and with local private sector and voluntary organisations. This idea of local authorities having a community leadership role made its first appearance in 1998. The New Labour government's particular contribution was to introduce a series of funding schemes that encouraged, and in some cases required, such programmes to be undertaken through formal partnership. So they formalised relationships that were already in some cases in existence, and to promote partnerships as the new paradigm for policy making and service delivery. Now, this can easily tie in with the idea of meta-governance, right? Central government is using things like financing, funding, blah, 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 to structure how local government operates and how these governance networks, how they look, right? Who is included in them? Well, by what Bailey and Wood would term network framing, right? Structuring the fiscal conditions through funding, they can make policy networks broader and including more of these private sector and third sector or voluntary organisations, right? Prime example. And if that was what you were writing in your essay, well, hopefully it'd be more succinct. But also that would be an example of you taking a theoretical framework, meta-governance, and applying a policy reform to it, right? Saying this policy reform is an example of meta-governance by New Labour. Okay. So this emphasis on the new paradigm was made by Tony Blair himself in 1998. He says, "The days of the all-purpose local authority that planned and delivered everything are gone. They're finished. It is in partnership with others that local government's future lies. Local authorities will deliver some services, but their distinctive leadership role will be to weave and knit together the contribution of various local stakeholders." And so again, we can see that central government is, using tools of meta-governance to create a shift to local governance, right? And it's not as if it was even hiding this. For local authorities, partnership working had obvious attractions. Partnerships can overcome the limitations of separately run services in meeting the need of some of society's most vulnerable groups. They could in some cases increase citizen participation and community more effectively than democratic local governments seemed able to do. And so we have a situation whereby, the best local authorities were involved in partnership work anyway, because it's an effective way to deliver goods, services, and achieve policy outcomes. But New Labour took it further by requiring it, right, and structuring rewards or financing in such a way that went from it being voluntary to pretty much required. Sullivan and Skelcher in 2002 identified across the UK some 5,500 partnership bodies stimulated or created directly by local government, spending 4.3 billion a year, and they speculated that the total number, including partnerships formated without stimulus from the government, was probably double, closer to 11,000. An actual total expenditure could have been closer to 20 billion. And the number of, and this is another important factor, the number of partnership board positions was around 75,000, which is more than, executive Quango memberships and well more than the number of councillors. So these local partnerships, they vary in every conceivable way. And there's little scope for local authorities to refuse or reject a new Quango or a new partnership. But there's also no consistency in how they're structured, and this includes in how transparent they are. So partnership doesn't always work, right? The partnership model has been unpicked or at least deeply analysed by people such as Skelcher as undermining the voice of local authorities, their functional sovereignty and their political authority as the democratic voice in the community. So local strategic partnerships can be a forum for bargaining amongst leaders of constituent bodies in terms of which organisation can maximise their power, rather than for the public interest. And there are costs to running all these boards, these partnership organisations, of money, resources, time, massive opportunity costs. Most authorities do not know the number of partnerships they are in, nor the cost involved in them, which, when you think about it, is just absolutely staggering. Without this knowledge, it's hard to evaluate best performance or effectiveness, or even to see things like overlap, right? The state should know what it's doing. Amazon knows what it's doing, so the state should know what it's doing. And this also leads to a lack of accountability and to scrutiny. It is impossible to claim an effective management of resources or to provide benefits value for money analysis. It also perhaps leads to a situation where councils end up with responsibility but without effective power. Democratic legitimacy gives them a natural leadership role in partnerships, but not a monopoly on leadership itself. But yet, only the local authority is punished at the ballot box. You can't vote out a quango. And there's also the potential for it to lead to local populist politics, with an increase in dissatisfaction in the powerlessness of local authorities or councillors, leading to outsiders who promise to stand up to the quangos or reject the governance model altogether. And then this will do little to actually affect real change, given the power asymmetry within the central-local relationship. And then there's also the risk of lower turnout or just completely switching off from local politics. If voters don't feel like their local council actually has any power over the decisions that are being made on a local level, then why bother voting? So the Public Bodies Act 2011 had an impact assessment, which is part of a process that all legislation goes through. And found that public bodies employ approximately 110,000 members of staff across 766 bodies. Now, in September 2009, David Cameron, just then the leader of the Conservative Party, gave a speech in which he promised that a Conservative government will carry out a review of all quangos. The existence, he said, of each and every quango must be justified by passing one of the 3 tests we have set. Does it undertake a precise technical operation? Is it necessary for impartial decisions to be made about the distribution of taxpayers' money? Does it fulfil a need for facts to be transparently determined, independent of political interference? If the answer is yes, it will stay. But if the quango in question does not pass any of the tests, it will go. Its functions assumed by departments of state, and we can save a huge amount of money. Now, this fits in with a broader pattern of debate over the quangocracy. Typically, parties in opposition promise a bonfire at the quangos, only for the reality to prove more difficult. So, for example, the MP for Stoke-on-Trent Central at the time, Tristram Hunt, in October 2000 said that the much vaunted bonfire of the quangos has turned into a clammy Sunday afternoon barbecue. For Flinders et al., there exists a rather stark rhetoric-reality gap, whereby governments come into power committed to radically reducing the role and number of quangos, and ensuring that those that continue to exist do so within a clear, transparent framework, governance framework. This was true for the 2010 Conservative Manifesto, which made reference to the fact that the activities of local councils were being micromanaged by unelected quangos. And this, ties in with the Local Government Act as well, where they gave local authorities, the Localism Act 2011, where they gave local authorities the kind of general power of competence. So, there was some authenticity to the claim that the coalition and the Conservative Party wanted to free up local authorities to some extent, although obviously it's balanced out against, crippling levels of austerity for local authorities. So the Public Bodies Act 2011 was an attempt to see through this dedication to reducing quangos, and it was largely a piece of enabling legislation which would allow ministers, by order, to make, abolish, merge or transfer the function of the public bodies listed in the schedules to the bill. Right, so by 2012 it was reported that more than 130 bodies had been abolished and more than 150 merged into fewer than 70 bodies. So an overall reduction by then of around 220. This is against a total of close to 900 bodies identified by the coalition. And by 2015, the number of arm's length bodies was down by 285 on 2010 levels. But a 2020 paper by the Adam Smith Institute stated that there were 1,162 UK quangos and 965 based in Whitehall in 2007. and it was reduced considerably by the coalition government's bonfire of the Quangos, which claimed £26 billion from savings. One of the things, like I said before, that is most confusing about this topic is that the terms and the definitions vary so much. So don't get bogged down in specific numbers, but I want you to reflect on the broader ideological debates and how it fits into this governance network theory and meta-governance. So for Flinders et al., the problem with a discursive emphasis on bonfires regarding Quangos is that the overemphasis of abolition and underemphasises reform. It also veils the manner in which many arm's-length bodies fulfil critical public tasks, and that for many cases Quangos are arguably best placed to do so, right? So they don't have, some things shouldn't be informed by electoral considerations, okay? On the other hand, there does seem to me to be a good argument for a clear, consistent legal classification of Quangos and detailed thought given to how we understand the relationship of Quangos with the vis-a-vis the state and vis-a-vis the executive. So as John Redwood says, basically everybody's happy for Quangos to be arm's length bodies until something goes wrong, and then suddenly they're the responsibility of the minister. And you can't have it both ways, right? You can't have a body that's independent in the good times and then calling for ministers' heads in the bad times, right? Because then you just get ministers micromanaging these things, and it kind of undoes the point or the purpose of having a administration, a Quango in the first place. So Quangos are often difficult to burn on the pyre because they perform useful functions. So despite all this, Flinders et al. Argue that the coalition government has adopted a more coherent and potentially significant reform agenda that is focused on reform rather than abolition. And the best way to understand the relationship between central government and Quangos is as a certain form of delegated governance, that is, an implicit acceptance of what is termed the hub model of government as the most appropriate organisational form. Now, in this model, the ministerial department forms little more than the policy-making core that directs and commissions the activities of a wide range of delivery or regulatory bodies in an almost perfect form of steering but not rowing. The implicit nature of this design logic is revealed in the commitment to create a slimmed-down and more efficient centre that enables and empowers. This is a mirror image of the governance network model we've been looking at a local level. Now, by dividing the functional responsibilities of the state amongst a range of single-purpose Quangos, the government has been able to, in effect, depoliticise service delivery and develop specialist skills. Thus, the government benefits from moving responsibility whilst also building the capacity of the state. For example, the coalition government's commitment to cut the number of Quangos stood alongside plans to create 17 new ones, such as the Office for Tax Simplification and the Office of Budget Responsibility. Now, the justification for these moves was to increase democratic accountability. So as Francis Maud told the House of Commons on 14th October 2010, the primary objective reform was to increase accountability, the important presumption that when an activity is carried out by the state and there is no pressing need to do so at an arm's length from government, it should be carried out by someone who is accountable democratically, either a minister who is accountable to the House of Commons, accountable to the public, or a local authority that is accountable to local residents. Public bodies will be expected to become more open, accountable and efficient. But this view was challenged by the Public Administration Select Committee. In their 2011 report, Smaller Governments Shrinking the Quango State, they argued it was not necessarily the case that reducing the number of Quangos would improve accountability. They said, "We also believe that bringing functions back into sponsored departments is likely to undermine other channels of accountability, particularly with relevant stakeholder groups, and risk leaving policies fighting numerous other priorities for ministerial attention. This will mean less effective accountability and challenge on a day-to-day basis." Instead, the committee argued that some Quangos should instead become executive agencies. They said, "We believe the executive agency model offers the best possible solution." It allows ministers direct responsibility for policy, combined with the ability to influence it, while still enabling high-quality day-to-day accountability by stakeholder groups. We recommend that the government consider converting organisations which it intends to retain and move into government departments into executive agencies. If this is not feasible, we recommend that the government explains why this is not a workable solution. So the phrase Northern Powerhouse has been applied to a number of different policy commitments from 2014 onwards. There's no definitive or authoritative definition of the concept, or statement of aims or desired outcomes. It is necessary to infer these from government policy, from the documents or the announcements that they make. And so the breadth of Northern Powerhouse policy and the absence of an authoritative document and success metrics has led to accusations that the policy or the concept or the framework is ill-defined or unclear. It's been described as an umbrella concept, providing definition to strategies and policies with the overall objective of contributing to the growth of the economy of the North. However, the majority of publications from both the government and other stakeholders define the area covered by the three previous standard regions of the North East, North West and Yorkshire and the Humber. Others use this definition for the North, but appear to restrict the definition of the Northern Powerhouse just to the city regions within that area. Now, why is this important? Because the Northern Powerhouse represents a new form of, or perhaps not a new form, but just another quango with quite a large remit that also overlaps with other forms of new territorial governance, such as the combined authorities for city regions. So the governance changes driven by the devolution agenda are a further dimension to the Northern Powerhouse. Mayoral combined authorities handle some matters relating to the Northern Powerhouse, such as adult skills, employment and infrastructure investment, but it's not clear how these new models of local governance will align with the Northern Powerhouse. So in most devolved areas, an elected mayor is being created who will appoint a cabinet from the leaders of member local authorities. Now the mayor and cabinet, or the metro mayor and cabinet, will be held to account by a scrutiny committee made up of backbench councillors from the member local authorities. But combined authority scrutiny committees do not have any role with regard to broader geographic structures such as transport for the North, such as the Northern Powerhouse, such as the government's capital investments set out. So we've got this idea of the Northern Powerhouse and Transport for the North and these types of organisations that are supposed to level up, just being a form of another quango and perhaps an example of strategic overload. As elsewhere in England, Transport for the North is governed by a number of different local and national public bodies. Local transport authorities have responsibility for public transport and for the road network. Bodies such as Network Rail and Highways England have responsibility for infrastructure nationally. So as part of Northern Powerhouse strategies, particular governance arrangements have developed to allow for strategic regional input. The most significant of these is Transport for the North. Now at present there's considerable overlap between the different bodies with transport responsibilities, and in many cases this is complicated by the fact that those responsibilities are continuing to evolve. And so, it's good. It's all right that the Secretary of State in 2014, for example, argued that Transport for the North's vision was to bring together all the relevant parties to work in genuine partnership to establish a clear long-term strategic transport vision for the North of England that is shared by all parties and allows for the North to speak with a single voice and execute that vision. But without the funds given to Northern leaders or Transport for the North, that is impossible. It's still going to be up to central government to fund it. And B, why does this need a new body to do, right? Why can't it be done within prior existing bodies? And C, why should transport be separated from other strategic considerations, right? So this talk of movement from city region to city region, or northern city to northern city, is important, but arguably what's more important is transport within cities. Most people work within the city that they live. They don't travel, especially in the north. And so being able to get from one part of the city to another is probably a much greater has much greater economic benefits than being able to get from Liverpool to Leeds half an hour quicker. So overall, whilst it's true that we've had quangos for a long time now, we're seeing the emergence of them alongside new forms of local authorities or of local government units, such as the combined authorities. And so this concept of governance, although it's not changing into something new, we're seeing more and more players enter the field, all of which have some form of strategic planning role. Okay, so if the main concern of metro mayors is to coordinate policy across a city region, and the main concern of the Northern Powerhouse or Transport for North is to coordinate policy across the north, right? Transport policy across the north. There's a lot of people doing a lot of coordination, all of which costs money, right? All of this is all very expensive to set up. And the question might be, do we need as many coordinators? Or perhaps we need fewer coordinators and more like doers? And really, there's only so much you can coordinate without actually having effective power devolved to you to actually do these things, right? Maybe if you wouldn't need so many bodies coordinating, network rail, high speed 2 limited, various transport authorities, if you gave local authorities power to come together and fund themselves these transport projects. But no, Whitehall is in control of the purse strings, and so a vast majority of the role of these coordinating bodies is to bring people together to develop a policy brief that they can then try to convince central government to fund. Okay, so to conclude, whilst quangos may come and go, local government is forever. John terms local government as the great survivor, right? It's able to weather a whole range of challenges for as long as it's existed in the UK, because ultimately it is the only body which is able to meet the continual need for administering tasks at the local level whilst being democratically elected, right? That representation role is the only unique thing that local government has going for it. Other local bodies, such as voluntary sector bodies and quangos, have less capacity to compete and work to shorter timescales. Many quangos have a shorter life, linked to funding streams, ministerial initiatives, the desire for a bonfire. And so, whilst we're used to local government taking the back seat when it comes to local central relations, when it comes to local quango relations, the shoe is often on the other foot. Previous studies of quangos show that they form close relationships with local authorities, often exchanging personnel. The leaders of these new organisations realise they need to cultivate good relationships with local authorities if they wanted to achieve their objectives. And so, the local government and quango relationship is a complex one. Not all quangos are equal, and not all local authorities are as open-minded or want to work with outsiders as others. The relationship is not just governed by structure, but personalities and the incentives set down by central government. And this means that often we have to really get into detail about particular policy areas and particular actors before we can really understand what is happening at a local level.